This is the story of Henry Goes to the Hospital. You can read along with me in your book, and you'll know when to turn the page when you hear this sound. Listen to that sound again. Now, let's begin. Henry the Green Engine is always happy when his passengers come and say hello to him. But on this particular morning on the island of Sodor, he had no one to talk to except the station cats. "Hello, Puss," said Henry with a smile. "Meow," replied the cat, ignoring Henry. Then Henry saw his driver chatting with a passenger he hadn't seen before. She was a nurse. Henry was worried. He used to be ill a lot and didn't like hospitals. "Why do I need a nurse?" said Henry afterwards. "I'm not sick again, am I?" "No, silly," laughed his driver. "That was Nurse Nancy. She's just started working at the hospital. She'll be a regular passenger of ours from now on." Henry soon became friends with Nurse Nancy and looked out for her every day. He liked her. She always said hello to him, and Henry always gave her a friendly toot-toot back. And if ever Henry was feeling a little under the weather, Nurse Nancy would get out her stethoscope and listen to Henry's boiler. "Fit as a fiddle," she always said, and gave Henry a pat. That made Henry feel much better. Then one morning, Nurse Nancy wasn't there. Henry was worried. "Have you seen Nurse Nancy?" the driver asked the guard. "Not today," said the guard. "I'll ask the ticket collector." "Have you seen Nurse Nancy?" the guard asked. "Not since yesterday," said the ticket collector. And the greengrocer, who was collecting some tomatoes, hadn't seen her either. It was getting late, and the other passengers were getting impatient. So the guard blew his whistle and waved his green flag. The train went without Nurse Nancy. Henry was upset. "I've lost my nice nurse. I've lost my nice nurse," he wailed. "Don't fret, Henry," said his driver comfortingly. "She's probably having a day off or something. Nurses have holidays too, you know." But Henry wasn't happy. To make matters worse, it was a stormy day, and the rain lashed at the carriage windows and thundered down on the roof of the cab. Henry travelled slowly and carefully down the line. He had never liked the rain. At the next station, Henry had to stop for a long time. The driver looked out of the cab to see what the delay was. "We've been waiting for far too long," he said. "There must be something wrong." "That's all we need," thought Henry. "Perhaps there's a flood on the line," suggested the fireman. He got down from the footplate and went to see the station master. Soon the station master came to see Henry's driver. He looked worried. "We need your help, driver," he said. "A little girl called Amy has fallen off her bicycle and hurt her leg." Henry's driver looked concerned. We should call an ambulance straight away. I've already done that, said the station master, but the ambulance has got stuck in the mud. I need you and your fireman to help push. Henry's driver thought for a moment. Then a smile came across his face. I know, he said. I've got a much better idea. What is it? Asked the station master, intrigued. Henry's train stops at the station near the hospital. Why not let Henry be the ambulance instead? That is a good idea, said the station master, and he went off to tell the ambulance driver. Henry was delighted to help, and very honoured to have been selected for such a special duty. If only Nurse Nancy was here to see me being an ambulance too, he thought to himself excitedly. Henry didn't know that his wish was about to come true. Soon 2 ambulance men appeared carrying a little girl on a stretcher, and there, walking by her side, was Nurse Nancy. Hello, Henry. This is Amy, said the nurse, comforting the little girl on the stretcher. Poor Amy didn't look very well at all, so Henry whistled a gentle doot-doot to cheer her up. Amy managed a little smile. Nurse Nancy smiled as well. Thank you, Henry, she said. That was thoughtful. Before the ambulance train could depart, the nurse needed to make sure that Amy was well enough to travel. First, she checked Amy's injured leg to make sure that it was strapped up firmly, but not too tightly. Then she listened to Amy's breathing with a stethoscope. Finally, she timed Amy's pulse. It was a little faster than normal. Don't worry, Amy, Nurse Nancy said, and she held Amy's hand. Henry will soon get you safely to the hospital. Henry thought that Amy was very brave indeed. Amy's stretcher was placed carefully inside the carriage on a seat next to Nurse Nancy, who made sure that Amy was comfortable. While the guard was explaining the delay to the other passengers, Henry built up steam and got ready to go. Steady, Henry, his fireman warned. I know you're excited about being an ambulance, but you haven't got a siren or a blue flashing light. That's right, his driver agreed. Not too fast now. We want to be sure that young Amy gets there in one piece, as well as on time. At last, everything was ready. The guard blew his whistle and waved his green flag. Henry set off, gently at first so as not to jolt the carriages, which might have hurt Amy's leg. As he pulled out of the station, Henry saw the 2 ambulance men waving goodbye to him. The back wheels of their ambulance had sunk down deep in the muddy verge. They were really stuck. But in the distance, Henry could hear the familiar chug, chug of Terence the tractor. Help was on the way. Henry made steady progress along the line. He kept up a good speed on the straight parts of the line, but was careful to slow down and take extra care at curves and level crossings. Soon the hospital was in sight. Henry's driver shut off steam, and Henry crept into the station and gently braked to a halt with hardly a sound. By the platform, another ambulance was waiting to take Amy the short distance to hospital. "Well done, heroic Henry," said Nurse Nancy. "You were a splendid ambulance. I don't know what we would have done without you." Henry turned slightly red and gushed a little steam in embarrassment. No one had ever called him heroic before. Two ambulance men carefully carried Amy's stretcher along the platform. As she passed Henry, Amy managed a little wave before being placed carefully inside the ambulance. Nurse Nancy shut the doors, and the ambulance set off for the hospital without delay. When Amy reached the hospital's casualty department, the reception area was already full of patients needing urgent treatment. So Amy had to wait a long time before a doctor came to see her. The doctor carefully felt the bones in Amy's leg. She said. "I don't think you've broken anything, but we'd better take an X-ray to make sure." Amy was taken to the radiography department. Here, a special camera took an X-ray photograph of her injured leg. Next, Amy was taken to the children's ward where a bed had been made up for her. Amy was delighted when she found Nurse Nancy waiting at her bedside too. "I've got your X-ray photograph here, Amy," she beamed, and placed the picture on the viewer. "You can see all the bones in your foot really clearly." "I never knew I had so many," said Amy. "Yes, there are a lot," laughed Nurse Nancy. "But the good news is that none of them are broken. Your ankle is only sprained." Nurse Nancy carefully bandaged Amy's ankle. "Just to help you keep it still for the next few days," she explained. Then a doctor came and looked at Amy's X-ray. "You'll soon be jumping about again, young lady," he laughed. "In the meantime, the best place for you to rest your ankle is back at home." Amy was pleased that she didn't have to stay in the hospital, and her strapped-up ankle felt much better already. Nurse Nancy took Amy outside the hospital in a wheelchair. A steam engine tooted somewhere in the distance. "Was that Henry?" asked Amy. "I didn't get a chance to thank him properly. Perhaps I could go home in his train." Nurse Nancy smiled. "Well, I had thought you would go home with your mum," she said. "But why don't you ask her? Here she is now." And at that moment, Amy's mum arrived in her car. Amy's mum was delighted to see Amy looking so much better. She helped Nurse Nancy lift Amy into the car and then folded up the wheelchair and stored it in the boot. "Time to go home, Amy," said her mum. But when she heard how Henry had helped in the rescue, she knew that the station must be their first port of call. Nurse Nancy came along as well. "I must thank my heroic Henry too," she said. Henry had been waiting at the platform, steaming gently. He was on his return journey and was ready to depart, but the signal was still set against him. He soon began to worry, especially when he heard from the station master that the fat controller was on his way to see him. "Oh dear," thought Henry sadly, "I do hope Amy is all right." But as soon as he saw Amy pull up in a car, he started to smile once more. Amy was delighted to see Henry again, and Henry was thrilled that Amy had come to see him. Now you've got wheels, just like me, he smiled. Amy giggled. Thank you for helping me, she said. It was fun riding to hospital in your carriages. You must come for a ride again once your foot is better, said the fireman. You can stand on the footplate. Everybody laughed. Henry had never been thanked so many times in his life. Amy's mum thanked him, Nurse Nancy thanked him, and the Fat Controller thanked him too. You are a really useful engine, Henry, he said. And a really useful ambulance too, added Nurse Nancy. Henry gushed steam happily. Then the signal dropped, and it was time for him to go. Beep, beep. Goodbye, Amy, said Henry. Get well soon. Goodbye, Henry. Amy didn't stop waving until Henry was almost out of sight. Henry has never needed to be in ambulance again, but he is always pleased to see Nurse Nancy, and is especially delighted when Amy comes for a ride too. And if ever he should feel slightly off colour, he simply remembers the day that he took Amy to hospital, and that always makes him feel much, much better.